Thank you, Scott, for the kind introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here this morning and looking at Houston and Texas from a comparative perspective. Actually shows amazing progress. There's a lot of things that have happened over the last 15 years here. But there's lots of more things you can be doing. And one way to find out what to do is actually to look at what other countries, other education systems are doing. And that's a great source of inspiration. It's not about copying and pasting what others are doing, but it's looking how different systems do similar things in very, very different ways. Why this education agenda is so important, you can actually see when you look at the impact which skills have on the success of individuals and nations. We recently, last year, we did a test of the mathematics and literacy skills of adults, the workforce. And we found that being highly skilled actually was strongly predictive of you being in employment and you getting an above median wage. But the story doesn't end there. We could also see that there was a strong relationship to many social outcomes. The health of people being related to what they know in mathematics and what they can do in mathematics. Their propensity to volunteer. People at the high end of the skill spectrum seeing themselves as actors in societies. They believe they can change things. They have an influence on what's going on. People at the low end of the skill spectrum seeing themselves as objects of society. They don't feel they have a say. And even trust is something that you might associate, with your sort of family, with the context, with the institutions of your city and so on. But indeed, being literate in mathematics is a very strong predictor of the extent to which you trust others. Why is it so important? Because trust is the glue of our societies. There's no business transaction that works without trust. There's no sort of social relationship that works without trust. So everything really depends on the fundamentals. But we're also seeing that there's actually been a dramatic change in the nature of the skills that make you successful. One of the things you can do is you can sort of divide the skills people have up into 5 broad categories. The first is about routine manual skills. And with this I mean, what you do with your hands and you do it every day in the same way. They kind of work in a factory, and you can see in the 1960s and 70s we built a lot of factories, and since then we need fewer and fewer of those people because those jobs get increasingly done by machines. Very easy to understand. There is also a decline in non-routine manual work, work that you do with your hands, but that is not so sort of easily described in an algorithm. That has sort of more flattened out because there's still lots of jobs out there that do require those skills. But indeed, the steepest decline in the demand for skills is no longer in the area of manual skills, but it's in what we call routine cognitive skills. That's about using your brain, but using your brain in a way that you can easily describe by an algorithm. And that's a real challenge for education today, because what this tells us is that the kind of things that are easiest to teach and easiest to test are also the kind of things that are easiest to digitize, automate, and outsource. If you've got a job that you can explain to someone else, exactly in what you do and how you do, then anybody else can do it, and that's exactly what we're seeing is happening. Computers are just a lot better on these kind of routine cognitive skills than humans, and that's why we're seeing these dramatic job losses now. Well, if this would be the whole story, the world would be very sad, and we would lose lots and lots of jobs. But there's also lots of jobs that are being created with new skills. One area is what we call non-routine analytic skills. This is not your capacity to reproduce what you learn, but to extrapolate from what you know, and to use your knowledge creatively in novel situations. It's very much the kind of skills that we are trying to assess in our PISA assessment, where we look not at the capacity of students to just sort of reproduce what they were taught in the last grade, but their capacity to make sense out of it, extrapolate, apply their knowledge. Big rise in demand. And there's the last category that's also very important. That's what we call non-routine interpersonal skills. That's your capacity to engage with other people, to interact with other people, to manage, resolve conflicts and so on. Innovation today is no longer about you having a great idea and doing it, but it's about you being able to connect the dots with other people across different fields of studies where the next innovation is going to come from. So you look at this chart and you can see there have been actually very significant changes in the way skills are being utilized in our economies. And then you ask yourself, to what extent have those changes been actually reflected in what we teach, how we work in education? And that brings me to the PISA assessment. We're looking at where we stand on this. You can see here a world map, basically a map of the countries for which we have comparative data, so we can compare Houston, Texas with much of the industrialized world. And we did our last assessment in the year 2012, testing about 500,000 students. And they took this test that looks beyond the reproduction of subject matter knowledge to the extent to which students can use their knowledge creatively. And the logic behind this is the world economy no longer pays you for what you know. Google knows everything. The world economy pays you for what you can do with what you know, and that makes a huge difference for you and everyone else. Very, very important. And I'm saying this because lots of people criticize our international assessments as being unfair. We confront students in classrooms with tasks that they haven't seen before. But that's exactly the idea. And if you consider it unfair, well, then life is very unfair to you. The test of truth today is no longer, can I do what I learned in school, but can I use what I learned in school to solve a novel problem? And then we collect a lot of data on the context of schools. We collect data from parents, from teachers, from principals, to get a good sense of the context in which learning results are being achieved. We think that's very, very important. So let's have a look at some of the results. The first thing, of course, and that's the great thing which the media always do, is they try to line up countries how they rank. Now you can do that. Green are the countries with very strong performance. Then yellow is sort of so-so, average. And in red, you find the countries with performance below the average of the industrialized world. And you can see there's huge variability in the learning outcomes of 15-year-olds. Those are the ones we tested here, in a field like mathematics. Huge differences. At the top of the league, you find many East Asian countries. Mathematics is a big strength they have, but also your northern neighbor Canada is doing quite well, some European countries, and so on. A lot of differences. The United States is sort of in the middle, but sort of quite challenged. And what's also important is that about a quarter of American 15-year-olds are really performing very, very low. Level 2 in mathematics is sort of where you move from sort of knowing fundamental mathematical concepts to being able to do something with them. And you can see actually a quarter of the 15-year-olds in the United States have actually great difficulties with this. And actually we have longitudinal data for other countries, unfortunately not the United States, which show that low performance at age 15 is highly predictive for actually a difficult transition into the job market. There's some variation within the United States. Massachusetts is doing really well, Connecticut so-so, and Florida comes sort of below the OECD average. You can see there's variation among states, there's variation among schools, there's a lot of variation among students. But I want to introduce a second dimension into the picture that we attach great importance to, and that's equity. In some countries, the social background, the context in which students were born, has a strong impact on the success. In other countries are better in mobilizing the talent from students from all social backgrounds. And that's very important, because if social background influences success in school, it means our societies are not very good in capitalizing on the talent of people. Everybody wants to be there, but performance is very strong and learning outcomes are equitably distributed. Nobody wants to be there, but performance is poor and there are large social disparities. And you can ask yourself, is it better to do well at the price of disparities? Some people believe that, in order to do well, you have to accept that there's variability. Or do you want to focus on equity and risk mediocrity? And if you look, for example, at the results, it's actually quite interesting, of Massachusetts and Florida, you might think you have to make the choice. No? Massachusetts doing well, large social disparities. Florida doing more equitable, but at a very low level of performance. No? But what's really interesting, and that's the first lesson from international comparisons, that you can actually square that circle and combine high quality with an equitable distribution of learning opportunities. The countries in the green quadrant do both things well. They do well on average, and they actually leverage the talent of children from all social backgrounds. So that is an achievable goal, a reasonable goal for public policy. I want to put one more last dimension into the picture, and that's money. I give every country now a dot. The size of the dot is spending per student. The larger the dot, the more money is being spent. The smaller the dot, the less money is being spent per student. And if money would tell you everything about the quality of learning outcomes, what would you see? You'd see all the large bubbles at the top and all the small bubbles at the bottom. But indeed, the volume of spending, the amount of spending, only explains about 15% of the performance differences. You can see, for example, Luxembourg, the big red dot there, no? Or the United States, they are a relatively expensive education system. It's still not at the top. And one of the things that you notice is that it's not how much you spend, but actually how you invest your money that's more predictive of success. Let's have a look at this by turning this around, and then I show you the red dot is money that actually arrives in the classroom, relative to spending capacity. And you can see, for example, the United States has a large dot, and a lot of money goes into the system, but in fact, only a small proportion makes it into the classroom. That's one of the things to really worry about. And the second thing is how you invest your resources. One way in which you can spend money, I want to highlight Korea, that's at the top here, is to pay teachers well. Korea does that. They try to sort of invest lots of resources to actually attract great people into the teaching profession. That makes education expensive. And the Koreans do one thing more. They say we don't only want to have the best teachers, we also want to have students learning for long school days. And that adds more to spending. Now that's the white part. And then the Koreans say one third thing. They say we don't only want our teachers to teach, but we want our teachers to continue to grow in their professional careers. We invest in professional development, in professional communities. A lot of money going into this, and you can see that makes Korea even more expensive. And now you ask yourself, how do they actually pay for this? Because the red dot is far lower than what they would actually spend, and the answer is class size. No? The Koreans have very large classes that actually reduces spending, and that allows them to afford great people in the teaching profession, lots of learning time, lots of other things for teaching. You can see Luxembourg, the next country on the list. Now, the red dot is where it is for Korea. Luxembourg spends exactly the same amount as Korea does. But Luxembourg spends its money very differently. In Luxembourg, parents like small classes, teachers like small classes, everybody likes small classes. This is where most of the money has gone. Smaller classes pushing spending up. But even Luxembourg can spend its money only once. And the consequence is that they have very little money to pay teachers well, lower than average instruction time, and teachers have little time to do other things than teaching. And the yellow segment is very short. And when you go to the low end of the spectrum, you compare Finland and the United States, and suddenly you see, Finland, a very different cultural context than Korea, but it spends its money rather similarly. It prioritizes the quality of teaching over the size of classes. And the United States is more like Luxembourg. It prioritizes the size of classes over the pay of teachers and other variables. And when you actually do that analysis in a more complex way, you can actually see that high-performing education systems typically invest and prioritize teachers over the kind of size of classes. Another country, and I know you talked about Singapore before, another country that is like Finland and like Korea is Singapore, and putting a lot of emphasis in the quality of the instructional environment and paying for this largely with class sizes. I wanted to give you an example and listen to how they use, for example, modern technology to create a window into individual students thinking in a very large class. Listen to this.
So we look at technology very meaningfully, and we see how can we leverage this technology to make a very significant impact in the classroom instruction. I'll give you an example. In a classroom of 40, it is really impossible to get 40 students to ask 40 questions at one go. When we use the instant messaging tool. We opened 40 windows to 40 kids. They could ask 40 questions at the same time, and the teacher could see their thinking on the technology tool that they use. And kids get more excited because they are using the tools that they are very, very good in using, not just the pen and the pencil.
Right, everything consolidated on one PowerPoint slide. Use the main thing as a skeleton, then you add on to the different parts. Okay?
A lot of our younger teachers are coming in. They're a lot more savvy in the use of information communication technology tools. And I see them teaching the more senior teachers how to use those tools effectively.
So it's really sort of interesting to see. Singapore pays its teachers as better than it pays its engineers. They're one of the most prestigious occupations you can get into. They have wonderful instructional environment, modern buildings, a high level of technology, and they pay less per student than does the United States. That is largely a function of the way and how they actually spend their resources. But I want to introduce one last point, and that is change. You know, some people say, well, what you see here is just a reflection of culture. No? We can never get to Singapore or China or Finland because those systems are in a very, very different kind of cultural context. And that is, of course, true. But one of the most powerful arguments against it is the change that we have observed across countries. Have a look at this. When you see, for example, where the United States came from and where it is today, it has actually moved. It has moved towards closing some of the social gap. It's moved to the right side of the spectrum. No? It's not that things have stood still. Things have changed. You can see the same thing if you look to China or Singapore. This is where Singapore was. This is where Singapore is now. These systems keep moving. At the very low end of the performance spectrum, Turkey, very impressive. No? Moving upwards, raising performance, closing social gaps. Germany, another country, moving upwards, closing social gaps. This tells you that we can actually change things in very small periods of history by a large margin. Or Italy, moving upwards, a little bit to the right. Poland, very impressive performance gains. Or you can see Portugal, moving a bit to the left, that's the wrong side, widening social disparities, but at the same time improving performance by a large margin. And actually, when we look at this overall, we can see that among the 65 countries for which we have data, 40 have seen gains in improvement. That tells us actually that the world is changing. It's not about culture. These countries didn't change their culture, or they didn't fire their teachers. They actually did things differently. And we want to look at those kinds of factors that they have actually achieved. One question, of course, everybody asks as well, you know, to what extent does the social context influence outcome at the national level? Is it fair to compare Mexico with Japan? No. Two countries in a very, very different environment. And one of the things that we have actually done is we have taken the context into account, and we assume, and that's basically what you see in the red dots here, that every country is working in the same economic and social environment. The yellow dot is the real performance that we measured. The red dot is the red bar is the adjusted performance. And you can see for the United States, it doesn't make much of a difference. There are some pull factors, some advantages the United States have, and it has more money, it has better educated adult population, sort of a lot of factors that are playing in your favor. It has also some challenges, a more diverse population and so on. For other countries, it makes a huge difference. If you look at Vietnam, for example, Vietnam did quite well on the PISA test, but had Vietnam the kind of cultural and economic resources of the United States or other countries, it would be a lot better. It would be number 4 in the world. So for some countries, context makes a difference. In the case of the United States, it's actually very little. Let's have a look beyond that. Social mobility. I mean, one of the hopes that we all have is that children from disadvantaged backgrounds will make it to the top of the league. And actually, I have some very interesting data on this. Here I mark the performance by the decile of social background. And you can see in Mexico, for example, the poorest children do worse than the most privileged children. No? That's what you would expect. And in fact, you do that for other countries, and you can see it's the same in every other country. But now look across countries. You look at the poorest kids in China, in Shanghai. Children from very, very difficult socioeconomic contexts, living in real poor areas. And you can see they actually outperform the children of wealthy kids, wealthy parents in most of the countries. What does this tell us? It tells, yeah, poverty is a drawback, it's sort of it's a barrier to success, but to a very, very different extent across countries. In some countries, the most disadvantaged children outperform the privileged kids by a very, very large margin. Again, that tells us, why do I show this? Because it tells us what is possible. What can we achieve in leveraging success? There's one other measure that we have done for this. We have looked at what we call resilience. The likelihood of children from the quarter of the bottom spectrum of social background to become top performers. And again, you can see a group of countries where you can actually see that a large share of those children make it to the top. Then you see a middle group where it's happening for some, and then you see a group of countries where you can see poverty is destiny. And again, there is variability in the United States. Massachusetts has a greater degree of social mobility. Florida, actually, very limited chances for if you are to the group of top performers. What does it tell us? It tells us we can do something about it. This is not the social context, but the success of the education system to leverage social background. Very, very important. One point I want to make is that this is not just, when you look at the overall lower results, it's not about, you know, poor kids in poor neighborhoods. No. In fact, the performance challenges are visible for many kids in many neighborhoods. One of the ways in which you can study this is by actually looking at a group of students who have very, very strong results. And you can see in the case of Massachusetts, you have a share of 15-year-olds who are very, very strong in mathematics. They're really great talent, but you can actually get better to this. Now you go basically to a place like Shanghai in China, and this share of 15-year-olds achieving at that level is more than twice of what it is even in Massachusetts. Huge variability in academic excellence. Very, very important to keep that in mind. There's another way how you can look at this, and this is about by studying the relative performance variation that lies between as opposed to within schools. If you're on the right side of the spectrum, and you look at Taiwan, for example, no? Most of the performance variation is between schools. The school that you choose for your children has a huge impact on the outcomes. It's not so much the case for the United States. Actually, most of the performance variation doesn't lie between schools. It actually lies within schools. There are lots of children, for lots of teachers, who are struggling. Not just a few schools that you need to change. And I think that's a very important lesson for policy. It's really requiring a system-level perspective. It's not solved by just addressing a few underperforming schools, as sometimes people might think. So that brings me to the important question, what can we actually do to catch up with the top performers? And what lies behind the success? And that's a very, very difficult question to answer. We need to bring in a lot of knowledge and information we know about them. And I want to order the kind of things by their impact on outcomes. Now, the important things in the top, the less important things at the bottom. And I want to take into account the economic and political cost of actually doing some of those changes. That's also very important because, you know, it's interesting to dream about sort of important reforms, but if they're very, very hard to do, they're unlikely to happen. We all want to do things that are easy to do and very important, the quick wins. Nobody wants to put money into things that are actually not that important and very hard to do, but you know, unfortunately there's lots of things that are happening in the field of education in that quadrant. I talked about resource factors earlier. You want to do some things that are really important, but very hard to do. I call them the must-haves. And you pick up some low-hanging fruits, things that are maybe not that important but easy to do. Now that's basically the sort of structure I'm going to use for the rest of my presentation. And then you can think about different sort of levers that you can actually act on. And I'm going through them one by one. And I want to start with the top one. That's the commitment to universal achievement. Once you look at high-performing education system, in whatever economic or cultural context, you see that they place an enormous value in education. In fact, those societies generally put more value into their future than in consumption today. They would put all of their resources into the education of their children. That's particularly true for East Asia. But more importantly, they also believe that success in school is not about luck or talent, but it's about the effort you invest into this. We asked the 15-year-olds one simple question. We asked them, what do you believe makes you successful in mathematics? And many children in the United States, but also in Europe, would tell you, oh, well, success in mathematics, that's about talent. If I'm not born as a genius in mathematics, I'm going to do something else. If you ask that very same question to a child in Japan or China, Singapore, 9 out of 10 of those children will tell you, it depends on me. If I really try hard, I trust my teachers are going to help me and I'm going to be successful. And this tells you a lot about the underlying educational context. In the former case, education is about sorting. I can't really do very much about it. I'm going to end up where I was meant to end up. In the latter case, there's no tolerance for failure. Every child is expected to succeed, and every child is making the effort to get there. And that's what the data show us. In those high-performing countries, there's virtually no poor performance in mathematics. Every child succeeds to do mathematics reasonably well. We also see that those education systems have usually universal standards. And they're highly, highly pitched. They're not sort of putting minimum standards into the system, but they're very clear of what really good performance is. Every student knows it, every parent knows it, every teacher knows it. As opposed to a high degree of stratification in the system, tracking, streaming, all of those kinds of devices that assume that students have different destinations. And they're also very good in articulating who is responsible for student success and what's the role of parents, the role of students, the role of teachers. Accountability there is not about, looking at school performance or teacher performance alone. It's about everybody's responsibilities in the system, parents included. And let me show you just one piece of data on that. You can actually see that in an index of self-efficacy in mathematics that we constructed, that we measured. And self-efficacy is not about, self-concept. I believe I'm great in mathematics. Self-efficacy is the student's sense to which they are confident that they will be able to address very difficult mathematics problems they haven't seen before. And you can see that is a very strong predictor of success in mathematics within each country, but even across. There's a relationship between the degree of self-efficacy and actual performance. You can see, for example, Shanghai and Singapore doing really well. It's not true for all Asian countries, no. Japan and Korea, students are not very sort of confident in their own abilities. And this sense of self-efficacy is very important in life. It's one of the social emotional components that really matter. If you are very, very good in mathematics, but you do not have this inherent kind of belief in your abilities in this field, your mathematics skills won't help you when you encounter something that you haven't seen before. And you can see actually those things are highly predictive. We looked at the other side of the spectrum. We ask ourselves, who do students blame when things go wrong? And I'm contrast here France and Shanghai and China. This is the average. This is Shanghai. This is France. What you see here is that actually the French students blame anyone except themselves for failure. You can see, for example, they say, well, I've just been unlucky. The teacher did not get me interested in that material. The course material was too hard. All of the kind of barriers to success are outside my control. Much less the case in the case of Shanghai. And this again tells us something about the education system. Do we create that sense in the education systems that learning is something everybody can achieve if they invest the effort? Very, very important. Parents, very important part of the equation. One of the things we did is actually, we looked at how the attitudes of parents to education shape the success of their children. You can see, for example, in this chart, the fact that parents expect their children to do well in education has a big impact on many, many different factors. Here I just mark enjoyment in mathematics. That parents' expectation influence student success. We know that. That's established through the research. But students whose parents expect them to do well also enjoy learning They are in a more constructive disciplinary climate. Education is more important to them. And one of the things that we found really interesting is when you look actually, what is it that drives that success? It's not about, do you have an academic degree as a parent? Or do you spend hours of time on the homework of your children? Those things are important, but not that important. What was a lot more important is whether you as a parent show that you value education. The simple question, whether students ask children every day, how was school today? What did you do? Those questions are as predictive for student success. The fact that over a dinner table, parents talk to their children about education, those things were as predictive on the success on the PISA test than were basically aspects like social background. There's a lot with very simple means every parent can do to help their children succeed. Let's go to the next part, Gateway's instructional system. Very, very important. What we see in high-performing systems is that they attach great importance to high-stakes gateways in the system. What you do in school really matters for your life. In most high-performing education systems, you cannot buy yourself into a university. Your success in high school is very importantly influencing your future educational pathways. No employer is going to hire you without doing well in school. And that message is understood by every parent, every student. High-stakes gateways in the system, and they are very closely aligned with the instructional system. Basically, you can see that the way the standards are being set, the way the gateways are defined, the way the instructional system works, everything is modeled very, very closely to fit together. We also see a high level of metacognitive content of instruction. What do I mean by that? That means that mathematics, for example, is not just an agglomeration of formulas, equations, mathematical procedures, algorithms, and theorems. But students actually understand the language that is behind it. They understand that mathematics is a language to describe, analyze, predict, shape the world, rather than just an abstract school subject. We did something very interesting. And in July, we're going to publish our first test of financial literacy, where we tested actually the capacity of students to sort of deal with financial concepts, which is very important today in a society today, to have people who are literate in these kinds of fields. One thing that we found very interesting, we looked at the extent to which financial literacy is taught in schools. And we would have expected that countries that teach more financial literacy have better results in financial literacy. But we didn't find any such relationship in the data. Very puzzling. And then we looked actually, the best predictor for students' capacity in financial literacy was not how many hours of financial literacy they had, but whether they had a deep conceptual understanding of mathematics. When mathematics was taught well in those countries and those students performed well on tasks that required a deep conceptual understanding, students had no problems extrapolating to the field of financial literacy. They knew this language, this kind of metacognitive level was very well established for them. When students were just taught the surface of a subject like financial literacy, it didn't have an impact on their results. And that's part of the problem of many instructional systems which have this kind of mile-wide but inch-deep curriculum, where a lot of things are taught at a very superficial level. And I must tell you, that's a bit the kind of picture that we get when we look at the performance of many American students on the PISA test. They get the first layer of the problem right, which actually asks for sort of the broad understanding, but as soon as they have to demonstrate deep engagement with the task, fundamental conceptual understanding, what is probability, what's change in relationship, all of those kind of concepts, students have great difficulties. Very important for the kind of instructional context. I want to go to the tough part of the agenda. To the left side, very, very hard to do, building capacity at the point of delivery. In one way, it's very simple. No? The quality of an education system can never exceed the quality of its teachers and instructional practice. But how do you actually build that capacity? Some people say, well, it's very easy. You just have to attract great people into the teaching profession. Some countries do that. That's true for a country like Finland and so on. But it's actually not true for many. Many countries get pretty much the average person to become a teacher. But they invest in those people. to become great teachers. They basically are very, very good in attracting, developing, and retaining great people in the teaching profession. And that is in part to do with the salaries, but more importantly to do with the kind of work organization they provide. There are a lot of opportunities for people to grow in their careers, to work with other colleagues, to sort of collaborate across different fields. Very, very important part of this kind of equation. They provide a lot of instructional leadership, having principals who are not a manager of a building, but who are actually developing human talent at the school, bringing students and teachers and everyone together. They keep this teaching profession intellectually attractive. Teachers are not just delivering prefabricated content, but they are meant to own their professional standards. It's a lot of professional autonomy, but in a collaborative culture in those kinds of education systems. The education system is created by the people at the front line. Very similar to what we see in a field like medicine in the United States. Who does, in the United States, medical research? It's not only university professors, there are some, but it's not the area where the research gets done. It's by practitioners who work every day, who sort of try to advance their own practice. And that's very much the image that we have of the teaching profession in some of these high-performing education systems. And it's actually mirrored in the way in which teachers are developed. If we go to Finland, for example, teacher training, teacher development. First, it's very hard to get in. They get 9 applications for every post. And then they actually have to spend a lot of time in the classroom, where they actually learn in a real school setting to develop this. Have a look at this, how it works.
So the teacher trainees need to have a certain amount of years of their subject learned at the university before they can enter the teacher training program. Teacher training for subject teachers lasts for a year, and so initially they start with theory. They are at the university for some weeks. Then they come to us for a period of orientation where they meet their mentor teachers and they get to see the classrooms. And then there's a period during which they teach in pairs. After that, they go back to the university to get some more theory. They also have now some experience. They're able to maybe ask different questions because they have some experience from the practical side of things. And so it's kind of a wave back and forth between coming to get the practical side at the school and then going back to gain some more information regarding
all
theory.
this practical experience alone. They also have to do a research master's thesis. And you ask yourself, why would you want a teacher to do a research master? And the idea in Finland is that's very natural, because we want teachers to remain inquisitive, to actually contribute to their profession, to remain researchers throughout their lives, to advance the profession. In many countries it's like this. If you are in Singapore, you start often your teaching career with a bachelor degree, but you'll continue to study, and then later in your career you'll do your master's, and that actually helps you to grow in your career. A lot of investment in the profession. It's also implicated high volumes now. In Singapore, every teacher gets 100 hours every year to advance. In Shanghai, in China, it's 240 hours invested in the education, continuing education of teachers in their first 3 years when they actually enter the profession. Very, very important part of that. I want to say a few words about incentive structures and accountability. That's obviously always a very important part of high-performing education systems. And this is not just about, testing schools and testing teachers. Actually, not even primarily. In most countries, the stakes are squarely placed on the students. Accountability is about helping students invest in things that are really important, even if they are hard to do. It's about having students sort of understand what matters in education. Those gateways are very, very important. For teachers, it's about to look at their relative strengths and weaknesses, but it's much more about encouraging and incentivizing teachers to make innovations in their field, to improve their own performance, but also the performance of their colleagues, to advance the profession. It's usually about a balance between what we call vertical accountability, shifting information upwards in the system, and lateral accountability, sharing information with your colleagues. You can see some education systems that do really well, and that do well for every school. Very little performance variability between schools. And that tells you every school knows what every other school is doing. Every teacher knows what every other teacher is doing. There's a strong sense of knowledge, mobilization, and sharing throughout the education system. I want to show you just a couple of data on this. And this chart might actually surprise you. It looks on the vertical axis at the performance of systems, and on the horizontal axis at the sense of responsibility or autonomy that schools have in the area of, for example, curriculum and assessment. And you can actually see the United States very much to the left side. If you think about it, the United States is the sort of the model for local control. There's no country that has devolved decision-making as much as the United States has. So how do you find it on the left side of the chart with actually very little degree of responsibility at the level of schools? Well, if you think about it, there's a lot of power at the level of the states in the United States. There's even more power at the level of school districts. But if you are in a school, as a school principal, it's much harder for you to think about, you know, this is the person I want to hire to work with. This is the salary I want to pay this person. This is how I want to design and devise my instructional environment. If you go to the United Kingdom, very similar kind of structure of the education system, but schools have a lot of responsibility to shape their own instructional environment, to think about whom they want to work with, how they actually structure teaching careers. Japan, no? Very much on the right. You know, you might think of Japan as a highly centralized education system, and that is very true because in Tokyo you find a huge bureaucracy in the ministry. But at the very same time, you know, schools are the owners of their own affairs. A lot of responsibility. The relationship isn't perfect, you know, there's a lot of variability in this, but there is a positive relationship between local, school-level ownership and outcomes. But it's actually tricky. You have to see that in a context. If you are in a framework where there is no shared understanding of what good mathematics is, we have an index that we call standardized mathematics policy, but all this is about is really about, does a system have a clearly articulated standard that is used by the school? If that's not the case, you can actually see that school autonomy works against you. The more autonomous schools are doing less well. Very different from what we've seen before. But if you're in a context that has a shared understanding of what good mathematics is, you can actually see that school autonomy is predictive of success. So it's not autonomy yes or no, but it's autonomy in the context of a very strong shared understanding of what good mathematics is. Another facet of this, if school autonomy only means, you know, the principal decides on everything, but teachers are not part of that equation. Teachers are not part of the management of schools. You actually see school autonomy works against you. If you're in an education system where teachers are part of the system, where you have a system of distributed leadership, you can actually see that school autonomy works in your favor. Last point. It's about transparency. If you're in a school system where school data are not being shared, there's no knowledge in a school what other schools are achieving, you see that school autonomy works against you. If you're in an education system that offers a high degree of transparency, schools know where they stand, they get feedback every day, there's a strong culture of evaluation and inspection, you can actually see school autonomy works in your favor. So it's very important when you look at this internationally to look at governance in the context of those kinds of facets. And I'll just give you an example of how this actually works. I highlight here Singapore, which is very, very good on all of this. And it's not, what I wanted to show here is that it's not about testing alone. It's about multiple dimensions of quality assurance. When you look at this, for example, you can see that all schools in Singapore implement this shared notion of what the mathematics standards are. Most schools regularly consult with experts out of the school, people with another view on how to improve their performance. Every school mentors their teachers that are coming in. There's a lot of effort, a lot of investment being made in helping new teachers actually to grow in their profession. Written feedback. You might think about Singapore as sort of an autocratic, kind of hierarchical system, but no, there's no education system that pays more attention to listening to students, teachers, parents, to try to understand how can we make things better. External evaluation, very important. Internal evaluation, data recording, testing, all of those instruments are being used. And what is important is this multidimensional approach to quality assurance, not just one facet of this. And again, behind this is a culture of professional learning communities, where actually teachers walk together to frame good practice. Let's have a look how this works in practice. It's a very, very systematic approach also to classroom observation.
To do that, really we get teachers to work together, to collaborate, and to look at each other's practice in the classroom. I think that is essential and really very critical, because the good teaching practices should not reside within the four walls and be kept to one teacher, and I think there is a lot of sharing that we can have in this school.
What you want to do right now is, okay, think of the Socratic questions, okay, what do I want to use to further define, clarify? Now, okay, I will go on the internet, I will find any sort of evidence that will help support this statement or refute this.
Professional learning community in schools was started basically to ensure that teachers had a platform to develop their teaching practices. Our main focus actually is to make sure that students learn best. And in order to do that, we have to collaborate. We exchange ideas, we try out, we test, and eventually we check for results. And the intention really is to share ideas to make it better.
What makes Singapore and many high-performing systems different is that it happens in every school. It's because it's part of the education system, it's part of the culture, it's part of the approach everywhere in the system. Investing resources where they can make most of the difference, big, big challenge for many education systems. And that's actually something that we see. We see that high-performing systems make wise spending choices. They don't spend a lot of money often, but spend it very effectively on the things that really matter. And they also sort of align the resources with the challenge. If you are from a privileged background, it doesn't matter whether you go to school in Houston or in Finland or in Shanghai or in Brazil. Actually, the performance of children from privileged backgrounds is good everywhere. Where the schools make a difference is where you do not have that kind of context. That's where public education can make such a huge difference. You can see that actually nicely in the data. Here I show you on the horizontal axis not how much money is being spent, but how equitably resources are invested, how well they are aligned. If you are beyond the zero line on the right side, it means basically you invest more resources in students that are more challenged. If you're on the left from the zero line, you actually spend more money on more privileged children. And this is how countries come out. And what you actually see in this is that there's a relationship in this, and that's really important. A more equitable investment on resources doesn't only get you more equitable results. That's what you would expect. That's obvious now. It also gets you better results, because it just means investing your resources more effectively, more efficiently. The country that does best on this, or the education system that does best on this, is actually Shanghai in China. They have devised all of their career incentives, all of their investment choices about attracting the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms. If you're a vice principal in a high-performing school in Shanghai and you want to become principal, the education ministry will tell you, yes, you can become a principal, but first help us turn around one of the lowest performing schools. So most of the high-performing principals will actually have started their career or evolved in their career by taking on greater challenges. And they're not left alone with this. They can actually bring several of their teachers with them so that they actually continue to link to that kind of professional environment. But it's a very important lesson that we have learned. Actually, investing resources equitably is the most effective way of doing that. The last point I want to make is, a lot of this actually starts before school. We actually see that children who had attended pre-primary education at the age of 15 perform significantly better on the PISA test, 40 points is one school year. So you can actually see, even after accounting for social background, that is a big part of the equation. Education that begins before you even enter school. Very, very important part. We need to keep those resources in mind when we talk about this. The last point I really want to make is about coherence. How do you ensure that basically policies are aligned across all aspects of the education system? How do you ensure that what you do today is consistent with what you're going to do tomorrow? How do you ensure that intended policies are implemented and achieved? And how do you ensure actually that things happen consistently in every classroom? One of the big challenges and one of the big strengths of many of the high-performing education systems. One country that has made a lot of progress in that field is actually Canada, and the province of Ontario in particular, that has over the last 10 years fundamentally changed its approach to actual education policy and practices, bringing a sense of direction into education reform. They didn't slow down in their reforms, but they brought coherence and direction into their reforms. And I interviewed previous Premier Dalton McGuinty, who had actually initiated much of this reform. And this is a short interview with him. Listen to him.
First of all, you need to bring to the task a sense of urgency, a sense that this is a very high priority. Then you need a plan. Then you need to enlist people to your cause, teachers included. And then you need persistence. Well, close to 4 out of 10 Ontario students are immigrants. So we have a student population that is extremely rich in its diversity.
We need to deal with that diversity. And so it's not seen as a barrier, it's seen as an opportunity and a challenge. And I think one of the ways in which we've done that is by ensuring that we provide more supports and more resources in meaningful ways to schools that are more challenged. So we can identify the proportion of children living in poverty in a particular school population. We can identify the proportion of children who come to school without either English or French as their first language. And then we can work with that school and that school district to provide additional resources and to build additional capacity in the teaching staff and in the leadership of those schools and districts to assist them in meeting the needs of those children.
Of an education system that has seen amazing changes in its performance. And that's really the main lesson to draw from this. We see improvements in the quality of education around the world. We see improvements in equity in education opportunities. Some improvements in value for money. International comparisons don't tell you what you need to do in your own system. But they tell you what everybody else has been doing and with what success. And that makes the world such a fantastic laboratory for educational reform. Thank you very much.